Hey, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We're very excited to have you here for Dom's Town Hall today, specifically around cookies. We're really excited to bring this to you. It's an extra benefit that we're just bringing to our clients, and it is based on your feedback. So we'd send out a survey. Really appreciate everybody that had shared that or talked with your client success managers about the topics you'd like to learn more about. And this was one that came up a couple of times, so we chose it as our next one in this series of what we're doing. So we're going to run it for you all. We hope that we have a really interactive session. We want to make sure that you get your questions answered as part of this. And then we will be doing another version of this more than a month out from now that we're going to release to the public. But again, just as a thank you to you for partnering with us here at DOM, we're giving you that information very early. Now, as we started outlining, how do we actually bring the information together here today? Like, how do we get you the expert information that you're looking for? We're really very fortunate. We had turned to Spilman Thomas Battle. It was the very first call that I made. We've had the pleasure of working with Spilman for 18 years now. I can't believe it's been that long. We've used them for a variety of different legal issues. We've referred our clients to them in many cases as well. Bottom line is we have a huge degree of trust because of the expertise that they've brought us over the years. So I reached out and said, hey, we want to talk about some of the legal ramifications of cookies and some of the things that are changing. Do you have anybody that might be an expert in this? And the great news is they do with Alison, and I'll introduce here shortly and give you a little more background on her. But we're very excited to be able to to partner with Spilman on this. They have offices, physical offices in 6 different states, and they serve their clients in a variety of different legal services on both sides of the aisle. And again, can't say enough good things about them, their managing members, their partners, and all the people that work at Spilman. Just quick information. I know you know a lot about DOM already. And by the way, I'm sorry, I'm Justin Cyber. I'm the president. If we haven't met, all the chances are we have. One of the things we'd like to talk about, we just got back from a trade mission in Turkey where we were speaking and meeting with folks. We've worked with clients on every populated continent, and we've helped them sell to over 150 countries around the world. So if we're not currently helping you export, we'd love to talk to you about how we can help you in those regards as well. You may just know us for 1 or 2 particular services that we're working with you. We wanted to show you very quickly what are some of those other services that we provide. So you probably think of us as anything that has to do with search engines, SEO, Google Ads. Please keep thinking of us when you hear those things. But we do a lot with analytics. Obviously, we're bringing you this information today. Really have some great website design, an amazing team here that we work with. And then any form of digital advertising, conversion rate optimization for your website, and then some of the other services that you see listed here as well. We will ask, reviews are very, very important to us. So if you've not left us a review, we always ask that you consider doing so. And we'll give you a link at the end where you can make it easy. But these are the 3 ones that we ask for typically. Clutch is the most important to us because they're very lengthy reviews, but it will take a decent bit of your time. Followed by G2, also very important, not nearly as much time. And then Google's always great as well. But we do appreciate your consideration in that regard. All right, with that, like I said, we have Alison Sacriponte. Very excited to bring her here with you today. She was who was referred to us at Spilman Thomas. We had not met before. And when I sat down with Alison, I was immediately blown away by how much background information she has in this area. Not that I should expect anything less, but it's always nice when you sit down and start talking with someone and you hear the questions they ask, you hear the information they give you, and you immediately understand their expertise on that. So Alison is an attorney at Spilman Thomas Battle. She advises clients on a variety of corporate, commercial, and compliance matters, but she has really, really deep knowledge in this area in specific because of her previous work. So prior to joining Spilman, she had worked internationally in Spain for an ad tech company. So again, really got to understand that side of things. And also got to deal with GDPR when that was first coming out and how those privacy regulations have moved on to what California released, and then how everybody's adopted that since then. So huge amount of expertise in data protection, privacy, web technologies in general. and she's able to provide strategic counsel for the businesses that are looking to achieve their goals while mitigating their legal risks. So, Alison, thank you for joining us, and I will turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Justin. Thank you for that introduction and your continued trust in Spilman. We're happy to be partnering with you on this, and I'm happy to be here. So thanks for the invitation. So I'm going to give you an overview. What is cookie consent? Where does the law fall on it? What do you need to be doing? Some of those tricky questions. So just generally, when we're talking about cookie consent, we're talking about the practice of obtaining permission from users before you send cookies or store or retrieve information on their devices. And this has become a hot topic in privacy law because people want online privacy, and there's growing concerns about what that means. So these data protection and privacy laws are popping up to give users a sense of control over their data and how it's used by websites. Brief refresher first, when we're talking about cookies, of course, we're not talking about the delicious kinds, but those tiny pieces of data that are sent by websites and stored on user devices. So cookies are used for various reasons, remembering login information and passwords, storing your user preferences, tracking behavior, personalizing ads, analytics, etc. A lot of reasons. Sometimes cookies are broken into first-party versus third-party. First-party cookies are set by you. They're the information that your website is collecting. Third-party cookies are set by other, and these are the ones that you're hearing about lately because they're now being phased out by Google and web browsers. And these are typically used for tracking and advertising purposes. So they tend to be the highest concern for online privacy.
And Alison, I apologize for interrupting. One thing I forgot to mention at the beginning of the call for everybody that's listening in, please use the Q&A box for questions. So we'll take those throughout at any point. If it happens to be something that is more specific to you all, we're going to wait till the end, and then we'll go through those questions at that point. If it was something maybe you didn't hear Alison or Steve later on, or if it was something where you just want a little more clarification, then I might jump in and address it at that point. But again, please use the Q&A box. We want to make sure this time is valuable for you all. And sorry about that, Alison.
No problem. Absolutely. I'll be checking the box as well. So happy to address any concerns in the meantime. So when we're talking about cookie consent and how it relates to privacy, privacy laws are being enacted all over the world. And cookies are regulated by those privacy laws because cookies collect a lot of information. So they're fundamental to privacy protection and thus regulated by these laws. So the central focus of these laws when it comes to cookie consent is getting websites to inform users about their data collection practices, what types of cookies they're using, why, what they're for, and then allowing users to make informed decisions about their personal data and how it's used, or obtain consent, which is what we're talking about now. And so briefly, before I dig deeper on what consent looks like, when we talk about privacy laws, it can get a little confusing because there are a lot. They might not all apply to your business, but sometimes they may. And so these are the main laws when we look for guidance on what to do, what do we need to comply with. The GDPR is sort of the king of privacy laws, and this was enacted in the EU in 2018. And it is the most strict of all data protection laws. And it is generally the example that other regions and jurisdictions look to when drafting their own privacy laws. And so one of the things the GDPR requires in terms of cookie consent is obtaining explicit consent. And I'm going to dive in a little bit more what explicit means, explicit versus implicit, opt-in, opt-out. There is a lot of terminology, but it can really be boiled down into a few basic choices. So the GDPR is the top privacy law that is regulating stuff like this. The e-privacy directive was another EU law and has been around longer than any of the others. And this was one of the first laws to require user consent, both for cookies, before emailing people, before any sort of communication. And so it's not that it's not relevant anymore, but it's sort of been trumped by the GDPR because the GDPR is more strict. Moving on, when you come to North America, we have the California Consumer Privacy Act. California is not the only state to have enacted privacy laws, but it is the most strict. So when we're talking about US law, the CCPA is generally what we're looking to comply with, that's the top tier here. And that's what a lot of other US states have started modeling their own privacy regulations on. Virginia, Connecticut, Colorado are a few that have already enacted privacy regulations. There are plenty more states that have them in progress. And outside of the US, we see Brazil, Canada, Australia, Asian nations. It's a trend that is happening all over the world, and we can only expect to see more privacy regulation in the future. Why is enforcement happening? So this is because these regulations are so new, they've only been out for a couple years, it takes a bit of time for the real world to catch up with that. And so now that we're starting to see enforcement of these laws, it's a little bit easier to understand what we need to do to comply, how things are going to work, etc. And so the enforcement of cookie consent is critical to protecting user privacy, ensuring compliance and industry standards, building trust, promoting ethical data practices, and enhancing the user experience. So keep these things in the back of your mind while you're thinking about your own compliance plans, what you need to do, and sort of just generally, why is all this happening? Because at the end of the day, it's to protect your users and to give them control. So now let's dig in a little bit on what that cookie consent actually needs to look like so you're in compliance with these regulations. Generally, you need a few things. Notice, that means it's typically you see a banner or a pop-up when you first visit a website, and it says something about cookies. Okay, we use cookies. These are what types, what they're for, etc. So that notice is the first aspect of your consent. Next up, we have options. Your users need to have options to accept, reject, and they should be specific to the types of cookies. Maybe they want to accept certain preferences and they like to have their shopping cart stay filled, etc. But they don't want their behavior tracked. They don't want to get targeted ads. They need to be able to make choices between the different types of cookies. Next up, logging. And this is a back-end requirement, but websites need to log that user consent for future reference and as part of their compliance, to make sure that they know and can prove that they've had permission to use these cookies. And lastly, management. It can't be a one and done type of thing. Users need to be able to change their mind. So maybe they accept all cookies initially, but later on, they start worrying about their privacy and they think, you know what, I don't want to be tracked. They need to be able to go back and change their preferences so they could reject some or vice versa. So this is where it gets a little tricky because, you know, when you're browsing the web, we've all seen, you get a pop-up and it might simply say, this site uses cookies. Okay. Or maybe it doesn't give you any buttons at all, or you could agree, accept all, etc. Sometimes there are toggles with the very specific types of cookies. There might be boxes. They could be unchecked, pre-checked, etc. There's a lot of options. And it's confusing because, like I said, there are different laws that apply to different people and that are regulated by different jurisdictions. Some of them get into the specifics of what your buttons need to say, whether they can be pre-checked or not. And we'll get into that in the next few slides. But generally, when you're determining what yours needs to look like, you need to consider what privacy laws apply to your business, So where your business is located, where you serve people, the location of your users. Maybe you're a hyper local business and only a few people in Pennsylvania visit your website. But generally, keep in mind, websites can be accessed from anywhere in the world. So if your users in California, then this is going to raise some concerns. And lastly, the type of information that your business collects. If you're a healthcare facility, you're going to have extra rules and regulations that apply because some of that data is sensitive. So before getting into what explicit versus implicit consent looks like, for all consent, all types, there are a few qualities that need to be present for that consent to be considered valid and to be in compliance with the laws. So firstly, that consent needs to be freely given. That means there needs to be a genuine choice where users can accept or reject cookies. And they need to make that decision voluntarily without any conditions. Next, they need to be informed. So users need clear, concise information, what cookies are used, why, for what purposes, and the details. Next, that consent needs to be specific. So this means the specific types of cookies should have their own consent. And so in some of those buttons we previously saw, there was accept all, reject all, or maybe just an okay or agree, or some sort of general blanket agreement. And in most cases, that's not enough. So the consent needs to be specific to the types of cookies and the preferences for each type. Next, consent needs to be unambiguous. You may see banners that they have buttons, but if you don't push any buttons, you can just continue browsing and the banner will disappear or the pop-up will go away and you can sort of just ignore it. That's ambiguous consent. So to be valid, your users need to actively and explicitly indicate their consent or lack thereof. So that means hitting the OK button, hitting the reject button. And that can also mean no pre-checked boxes or inferred consent. And we'll dig into the pre-checked boxes as well in a bit. But under certain laws, particularly GDPR, pre-checked boxes do not count as an active, explicit indication of consent. So there can be argument that those are ambiguous. Next up, revocable. Like I said, users need to be able to change their mind, and revoking consent should be as easy as granting it. And then demonstrable. Websites should have records of that, including when and how that consent was obtained, so that you have that in your records. So diving in a bit deeper into explicit versus explicit consent. Firstly, let's take a look at what each of those means. Implicit consent means that users are informed about the data practices and told that you're using cookies, and they have an opportunity to reject those cookies. That means that your users automatically agree to the use of cookies unless or until they say otherwise, meaning they hit the reject button or say no or uncheck the boxes, etc. So that means they automatically agree unless they tell you otherwise. On the other hand, when we're talking about explicit consent, this means that users are informed about the data and they expressly consent with a clear affirmative action. That means that they're saying accept all, they're checking the boxes themselves, they're moving the toggle to say which types of cookies they allow. And until the user does that explicit action, you cannot set cookies because they have not granted consent. So until they actually agree with an affirmative action, cookies cannot be placed. There's one caveat there, cookies that are strictly necessary for the website to function, those can always be utilized before any consent is needed. So what those look like, again, that for the implicit consent, that can be a blanket agreement. It can be a general, okay, accept all. It could have boxes pre-checked that are already allowing those cookies to be set, or it could be silence. Inaction could also be considered implicit consent. On the other hand, for explicit consent, no blanket consent, all, accept all, agree, okay, that doesn't cut it. And pre-check boxes don't cut it because the user themselves are not taking that affirmative action. Your website has already taken it for them if they're pre-checked. And so that's why it doesn't count as explicit consent. Generally, explicit and implicit are regional, and the GDPR is the main regulation that really spells out instances when explicit consent is needed and what that looks like. In the US, implicit consent is generally allowed, and there's more of a lax approach to what your cookie consent banner needs to look like. So besides from the regional aspect of things, when should people use implicit and when should websites use explicit? Generally, if you're a local US business and your users or customers are also local to the US, not California, but the other ones, you can get away with using implicit consent. On the other hand, if you have a legal basis for processing that information, you can also get away with using implicit consent. And I'll elaborate on what legal bases are for processing. On the other hand, if you have a global presence, you're a large company, you know that you have users visiting from all over the world. If you do business in the EU, if you are selling personal information, especially if it's personal information of minors, or if you're processing sensitive information, those cases absolutely require explicit consent. And you want to make sure that you are using the right types of consent depending on your particular situation. Because that gets tricky, I generally recommend following the most stringent method. So if you have an opt-in consent or an explicit cookie consent banner, that's the safest in all cases.
Hey, Alison, we have a couple questions coming in. Tina,
Yeah, sure.
yours is great. I'm going to come back to you at the end. But from Chris, what is considered sensitive information?
Yes, actually, Justin, if you want to pop up to my next slide, I am going to share those categories. That's a very good question. So when we're talking about sensitive personal information, this means any sort of health data, biometric data, genetic, religious or philosophical beliefs, racial, ethnic origins, political opinions, sexual orientation, gender preferences, trade union memberships. These are all categories of information that is considered sensitive. There can be gray areas within this information. Some things you may not think are health data, in some cases could be interpreted as health data. Again, I always say it's better to err on the side of caution. If you think something might be sensitive information, there's a good chance that it is. But these are the main categories of what is considered sensitive personal information. Is there any other questions that you wanted to chime in right now? Or that was it, Justin?
That's all I'm seeing from Chris.
Okay.
Knowing Chris, he might have some more, especially as it relates to some
Sure.
healthcare type things. But Chris, feel free to jump in, or we can get more questions from you at the end as well. But he's
Yeah.
saying thanks.
And healthcare, I think probably of all sensitive information, health data is probably at the top of that list. So moving on, when we are thinking about compliance issues, there are a lot of considerations, like we just discussed. Is your website gathering sensitive information? Do you need to comply with EU regulations or California regulations? So confusion from various privacy laws and what applies to your business can be one of the tricky parts in determining what the appropriate type of consent is for your business. Also, changing web trends. We are seeing this shift from third-party cookies and how that relates to your marketing and advertising plans and general business decisions. So there's some risk analysis involved in that. Maybe you know that you might get an occasional California visitor, but you're not too worried about it. It's few, so you don't comply with every single requirement of the CCPA. Those are some of the risk analysis that you would want to perform before deciding on your consent plan. And then the user experience design. I've never met anyone that's likes the cookie banner or any pop-ups really. So that's another consideration, is designing something that is appropriate according to the law and is also good for your users and is user-friendly. Another reason for compliance, maybe the most relevant or scary, is what happens when you don't comply. Failure to comply with these privacy regulations can lead to fines, legal penalties, audits and investigations, as well as reputational damage. Looking specifically at the GDPR and CCPA, which we've seen the most enforcement from so far in this field, GDPR fines can be up to $20 million, not 20 million euro, but so a little more than that in dollars, or 4% of your annual global turnover, whichever is greater. So that's a pretty huge fine. And in California, fines can be up to 7,500 per violation, but there's no cap. So that's limitless. So it may not sound like as much as the GDPR, but if you add up every instance or every consent banner that didn't pop up, that can be quite expensive as well. In addition to just the fines as well, keep in mind that if you have to go through the audit or investigatory process, that can be a long, drawn out process. There's legal involved. And so there are also, costs internally just for getting through that audit or that investigation, or, proving that you in fact are compliant. So there are not just the fines, but costs to your business for not complying generally. Some of the big ones that we have seen the past couple of years, Microsoft in 2022, they were fined $65 million for not providing an easy option to reject cookies and for using advertising cookies without user consent. Sephora, we saw that same year, 2022, 1.2 million for CCPA violations, that's the California privacy law, for using cookies for tracking and sharing data with ad tech companies, again, without informing consumers. They also did not have an opt-out mechanism, so users couldn't go back and reject those cookies. Another GDPR fine was Google in 2021, 162 million for not providing an easy way for users to reject cookies compared to accepting them. So when we say that users need to have a genuine choice and an unambiguous choice, you can't have an accept button that's bright green and really big and in your face, and then a reject button that's in very tiny font and grayed out, and you can't really see it because you're obviously trying to get people to accept versus reject. And so Google paid a big fine for not having fair choices there. And another massive one in 2021 was Amazon for violating the GDPR for using targeted advertising without proper consent. So these are pretty massive fines. And of course, these are huge companies that were the first targets of the enforcements of these regulations. But still, it's a good reminder of how important it is complying with cookie consent laws. So what I will leave you with to focus on when we talk about cookie consent, complying with these laws, the essential factor here is that your website needs to obtain consent that is freely given, specific, informed, and unambiguous. This promotes transparency, ethical data practices, giving users genuine control over their data, building trust, reducing legal risks. And it's really good overall for the industry. So taking compliance seriously on this matter is a legal and ethical imperative these days for businesses. And again, I think we're going to continue to see more privacy regulations, more enforcement of those regulations in the years to come. So it's not something that you want to brush under the rug. And the sooner you can proactively comply with these laws, the better off your business will be.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Allison. Really appreciate it. You have a lot of great questions that are lined up already that we will come back to here after Steve's thing. So really appreciate it. We will turn it over to Steve D'Angelo now. Steve is the team lead here, senior digital analyst at DOM. You can read what his bio says, but some of you have already heard from Steve. You might have met with him just being a client. Or you might have heard him on some of our webinars and town halls that we've done in the past. Short version is he likes his stuff, or he knows his stuff, and he loves sports. So if you want to talk sports, he will do that with you all day. Just don't ask him about college football because it's kind of a sore subject here for some of us in the office. And Steve, I'll turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Justin. So these first couple slides, I want to go through, as Justin said, I'm very much the data nerd here. I very much want to focus on what does this actually mean from a data perspective? How can this possibly impact some of the platforms that we use? So the first two we're going to go through here are Google products. So impacts on platforms for Google Ads. The obvious one being if a user is not going to give consent, that's really going to impact our ability to collect data on ad interactions, most importantly, conversions. So this is obviously going to hurt us from a perspective of, hey, we want to understand how our advertising is performing from a conversion standpoint or from a conversion value or revenue standpoint. That's going to be impacted, our ability to collect that based on user consent status. What might be a little less obvious in other ways it can impact us, though, is from a optimization standpoint. So there's the reporting, us seeing how the advertising dollars are resulting in conversions, but there's also the ability to optimize within the platform. So keep in mind, it's very common to be using different bid strategies within Google. The less information or the less training data that's feeding these algorithms, the less likely they are to be successful, the less optimized they will be. So more conversion data feeds the algorithm is typically yields higher success rates. So less conversion data coming in can actually end up impacting the performance of the advertising. And finally, the last piece with Google Ads is just retargeting. So we're all very used to a big one for e-commerce, for example, being cart abandoners. If a user has not opted in, our ability to capture these audiences and then retarget these specific audiences based on their behavior is going to be limited based on user consent. The good news is that for the first two things I listed there, Google is starting to implement a workaround that can help us from a conversion tracking standpoint. It's enhanced conversions. Some of you on the call may have heard me talk about this previously, but we'll get into that in a later slide. But moving on to the other big Google one is obviously GA4. So without user consent, GA4 can experience some pretty big data gaps that can hinder having a holistic view of your analytics. GA4 does put in some protections. So What GA4 will do is it will model some data to fill in these gaps based on available information for those who do not opt in. However, we'll see later in terms of using different kinds of consent mode settings within Google, how that data is modeled and the quality of that data modeling is really going to depend on your implementation. And even with the best model, it's probably not going to line up to the same standard that you'd be used to from just a strictly hit by hit raw reporting perspective. So moving on to, let's go to a couple platforms outside the Google suite. The big one being Meta Ads. So if for anyone that's been running Meta Ads for a while, you know, cookies have been a topic of conversation probably for about 4 years now. Big reason being is Meta historically relied heavily on third-party cookies. If you've been doing this as long as I have, you remember how robust the third-party audiences were in building advertising campaigns within Meta historically. They've done a lot to pivot away from that, but still give us a good way to still get results on the platform. However, with cookie consent coming up as well, it's just another wrench or a limitation that's kind of being thrown into the platform. We also don't have the benefit of Meta working within the Google stack. So the consent mode functionalities that we're going to get into a little bit later don't necessarily apply the same way that they would within the Google suite. But it's very similar here of what we had talked about previously with Google Ads. Heavy reliance on cookies for audience insights to create custom audiences, retargeting, and the other ones being behavioral tracking, conversion tracking. Those same limitations that we kind of mentioned within Google Ads are relevant within Meta as well. And finally, getting to one that's outside of an advertising platform. So we wanted to touch on one that would be a marketing automation or CRM. For this purposes, we're talking about specifically HubSpot as a marketing automation platform. So it's an interesting use case within HubSpot because within Google's consent mode, which we'll get into in a minute here, we're able to define using a CMP, okay, this is a cookie that we consider essential versus this is a cookie that is for analytics purposes. You have a little bit of control when using a CMP of how you're going to classify these things. HubSpot, because of how robust the platform is, because it touches marketing, sales, all these other aspects that rely a lot on PII, they have their own standards with cookie consent, meaning that I could, for example, try to classify through my CMP a cookie as essential. But HubSpot has the right to overrule us on that, saying, hey, anything that is a Google Analytics pixel or cookie, we are going to treat that as we need explicit consent for it to work. So it can really be limiting how HubSpot is taking the view versus how some of these other platforms are. Big reason for that is that HubSpot has to comply with these regulations like GDPR just because of the nature of the data that's stored within these platforms. And in terms of how this can affect you, I know a big thing can be lead nurturing, marketing automation, for example, setting things up within HubSpot, where if we have people who have viewed this kind of page, we want to hit them with this kind of an email nurture, a lot of that's going to be impacted by what their consent state is. Now, how do we mitigate data loss? And you guys have heard me say consent mode a couple times. This is really what I want to get into in this section. So what is consent mode? More specifically, Google's consent mode V2, because for anyone who pays attention to Google, they do an amazing job of naming their products in a creative way. There was, of course, a consent mode V1. We're just going to focus on version 2 because it's been rolled out for a little bit here, and it does have some more robust features than its predecessor. So GA4, consent mode is available within Google Tag Manager, and it's designed to dynamically adjust the behavior of tags based on the consent status of the users. It integrates seamlessly with different cookie management platforms or CMPs that are in Google's partner program. We'll have a slide later covering some of them. A couple big ones we've worked with previously are Osano and OneTrust. But if it is any of these approved vendors, and there are some benefits and disadvantages of each, it integrates fairly seamlessly within consent mode. And it does introduce two separate options within version 2. And this is one of the big differentiators from the predecessor. So advanced consent mode and basic consent mode. So let's start to look at the difference between some of these. For basic consent mode, essentially you are only going to be collecting data, any kind of data, once a user has explicitly consented. Before that, everything is going to be blocked. Whereas with advanced consent mode, you're going to be collecting data both when a user actually does explicitly consent, and some kind of data, these anonymized pings, if a user has not granted consent. So it's still not going to be to the same level of actually consenting. I'm not telling you that you are going to get the same data on me if I choose to reject all cookies than what you would someone that actually does grant consent, but you are still going to be getting modeled data, at least on conversion events, for both Google Ads and GA4 to help fill in some of those data gaps. And if we move forward here, this kind of gets into the varying levels of, again, this modeling. If me as a data person who has no legal background, I always want more data. And in terms of basic versus advanced, I can tell you from a data perspective, the advanced version of consent mode, you are going to get higher quality data. Because as you can see in the chart there, even though there is going to be conversion modeling in GA4 and conversion modeling within ads, it's not going to be based on proprietary data. It's going to be based on things such as we have here browser type, conversion action type, type of day, other non-specific, non-identifiable traits. Whereas in advanced mode, the quality of this modeling that happens before a user, either before a user grants consent or if they do not provide consent, is going to be much higher quality than it would with a basic implementation. The other piece here is for those of you who have a GA4 implementation who are using it quite frequently, this is just related to conversion events on the basic implementation side. If you want more behavioral modeling, that's only going to be available in GA4 via the advanced implementation. And here is just a list of different Google approved CMPs through their partner program. Again, two we have experience working with is both Osana and OneTrust. I know CookieBot is also one that's used pretty frequently. And if anyone has any questions, if you're considering different CMPs, there's actually a resource we can provide via Google that does a kind of a chart breakdown, checks, minuses for different features. Be happy to provide that and see what best fits your needs. And finally here, enhanced conversions. So another benefit within the Google stack besides consent mode is Google's given us another potential workaround for conversion tracking, and that's enhanced conversion. So what enhanced conversions do is, in theory, it's going to improve the accuracy of conversion track by using first-party data. So by collecting email, collecting phone number, if you are an e-commerce business where purchases have to obviously require a shipping address, those can be provided as well. What will happen is Google is going to hash this first-party data. We're going to collect it via Google Tag Manager. Google is going to hash this first-party data and then send it, the hashed data over. So in scenarios where cookie consent is not given, for example, enhanced conversions can still use first-party data to fill in gaps, and this can help give you a more comprehensive view of how your advertising performance is working.
Awesome. Steve, thanks so much. I want to bring this screen up and then we're going to start doing Q&A, but the first part, Alison has graciously offered that if anybody is looking for a free consultation, they want to talk through some of the things offline, she'd be happy to do so. So all of our information is here. You will be getting a copy of this deck. Your client success manager will be sending it off to you. So please feel free to reach out to Alison. And then on the DOM side of things, just a couple asks we're going to have. Number one is if you have questions about how we can help you out in any of these areas, please reach out to your client success manager, and they'll be happy to talk with you so we can see how we can help. And then, as always, we talked about the review. If you'd consider leaving a review for us, it would be much appreciated. And then always referring colleagues. So if you're happy with the work that we're doing for you and you have somebody else that you care about and think we might be able to help them, we always love having those conversations. With that, let's get to the Q&A. So Steve and Allison, if you both want to come back on, I'm just going to start picking through these. This is one I'm curious about. Tina had asked, do you have a good example of a site that does all of this correctly? And Allison, that came up originally, kind of middle part of your presentation, but if either you have an answer, it would be great.
Let me think. There are a lot of sites that that do it well, and you know, it's hard to think of one off the top of my head. I'm going to do a quick search on the web and see if I can find a very good one. But generally, you know, the best example are the ones that have a detailed list of the types of cookies that they're using and specific options for each type of cookie. So I'm sure that you've seen some banners that are more than just a banner, but a pretty big, you know, there's a lot of information there. That is, of course, is not ideal, not the most user, not so fluid. So sometimes you see banners that say manage preferences or review different cookies, or something that takes you to either a different page or brings up more information once you click on it. That's acceptable. And that can relieve sort of the hesitation that, you know, just putting a huge list of cookies and descriptions and everything all at once in someone's face. Having some sort of like see more option is a way to sort of work around that.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Thank you, Allison. And Tina, we'll be happy to jump in and drop some things in the chat if we see some other sites that we like. I would also say it's probably a little bit of, depending on your site, what's ideal for you might be different than what it would be for somebody else's site. I'm going to skip to Chris's question because it's related to what you were just talking about, Allison. Is a banner required specifically, or are there other less intrusive options?
The banner is what we see most often because, I hate to say, it tends to be the least intrusive of the options. That being said, it does not have to be a banner. If you want to come up with a creative way to get that information out there at the beginning of the user's visit to the site, that's an option. If it, you know, sort of complies with all of those things, it provides information, it gives options to the user, etc. So no, it doesn't necessarily have to be a banner, but I don't think I've ever seen a better solution, at least not yet.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I have not seen anything. I think it's a question of how do you design the banner? All the options you were talking about before, Allison, what's the size of it? And then just the aesthetics of it. Like, I've seen some stuff that's just really ugly and really off brand from the rest of the website that just doesn't add to it. So I think how you can minimize it in a way that kind of matches brand guidelines, the more you can customize, the better. Okay, this is a juicy one. For a US company, why do EU laws have jurisdiction? And then as a follow-up, what could be the ramifications of non-compliance?
So this, of course, gets a little fuzzy. Yeah. If you're a US company and you operate exclusively in the US, you don't have any, you know, foreign entities, the actual ramifications can get tricky because generally you need an EU nation that has jurisdiction over your entity, not your US entity, but something. So for example, the examples of Google and Amazon being fined by the GDPR. The case was brought against, I think, Amazon Ireland or Google in Ireland, because that's under the EU jurisdiction. However, if we go back to the fines, keep in mind that fines are based on annual global turnover. So even if you have a small partner entity somewhere in Europe, most of your business is in the US, though. Let's say you're doing 20 million in revenue in the US and 30,000 in Europe. That fine, even if it's against your European partner or entity or whatever, is still going to be based on your $20 million revenue in the US. So in some cases, it's true that they might not be able to bring an action of enforcement against you if you only have a US entity. That being said, as I mentioned, these other newer privacy laws that are popping up are really modeled after the GDPR. So you might not have to have the specific requirements of the GDPR, but it's sort of the goal or the best example of what you want to aim for. So yeah, to answer your question, they can't always enforce something against you. But depending on the type of information you're processing, where you're located and where your users are, it still could have an effect.
Thank you for that. In the Google example you brought up, it was a great call out about Google Ireland, because I think they were doing that. I don't remember the name of it. It was like called a double Irish sandwich or something, where they were running a lot of their Google Ads revenue through Ireland, even if it wasn't coming from Ireland, for tax savings is part of that. So probably opened themselves up to some liability with that. And then as a follow-up, Tina just asked, so are you saying that if you do not have a physical presence in the EU, that GDPR does not apply?
So yeah, again, it's a bit of a tricky area. It may apply because even if an EU national, let's say a French person is living in the US and using your website here in the US, you have nothing to do with Europe. That French national is still entitled to the protections of the GDPR. So technically it applies to your business. But you are correct that if you don't have any entity in the EU, there's going to be a very difficult, if not impossible, way to actually enforce that against you.
Thank you. And then Charles had asked earlier, are some businesses exempt based on the size or the revenue of the firm?
So there are certain exemptions that, for example, California has limitations on both size and revenue, whether or not the CCPA applies to that business. And those tend to be lower than any of the other privacy laws. The GDPR, for example, has a much broader spectrum. Pretty much if you're doing business there, it's going to apply to you. I think that more than knowing the specific limitations and whatnot, analyzing it from your own personal risk perspective, that would be the biggest factor. If you're a very small business, you're very local, you're in a tri-state area, you have more wiggle room on, okay, do I need to be 100% compliant with the GDPR? Probably not. So it really boils down to your particular business and where you fall in terms of what's applying to you and what's not.
Thank you for saying that, Alison. I think that's really good advice, and not just the what do you need to do strictly to be compliant, but what's realistic for where you need to be. Certainly anybody can be hit with drive-by lawsuits or trying to get a lawsuit and scare you into paying off some money. And I think you're a little bit protected if you're a smaller company where you're less likely to be hit, at least now, because they think there's, you know, the pockets aren't quite as big. Doesn't mean that you don't have zero risk behind it, but is that risk warranting maybe some of the efforts that you need to put behind things?
Right. Another thing I would add on that note is, you know, I think it's important to think about it in as part of the big picture, or as part of your business's privacy plan, because maybe it's not the cookie consent, or well, you think, well, I don't have an EU entity, so I don't need to comply with that. But if you consider it as you know, one piece of the whole privacy puzzle, not having appropriate cookie consent can lead to other privacy issues that may turn into different, you know, different types of violations. So, for example, if you're a HIPAA covered entity, you know, maybe the cookie consent is not going to be a huge violation, or you're, you know, you're not going to be fined under the GDPR. But it could also regulate, you know, are you HIPAA compliant with your, you know, EPHI? And so it fits into a lot of different pieces of the privacy puzzle. So I think focusing on that big picture, okay, am I getting user consent? Do they have actual control over their information? That's what you want to focus on. And if you have those sort of fundamentals, everything else will sort of follow suit. Or even if you are in violation, you have a pretty good defense, because you're like, hey, we're trying. You know, we're giving users control. We're doing this. We're doing that. Because to be honest, almost no one is 100% compliant with the GDPR or with, you know, other privacy laws. So there is always some risk analysis, some business decisions that go into that, but aiming for doing the right thing is a good course of action.
Awesome call out. Thank you for that. I'm going to get to as many of these last questions as I can. We'll get everybody out of here in the next 2.5 minutes. Steve, this one might be for you. What are the steps involved in setting up a compliant CMP, which I think was the cookie management platform, and integrating it within the website's, you know, current setup?
So I couldn't speak to integrating it within the website, because I think that's going to be very different from one CMP to the next. Also, that's more of the developer side of things, where developers yell at me whenever the analyst tries to be a developer. So I'll stay out of that one. But like, I do know that from a consent mode, like a GTM perspective, it doesn't require a lot outside of how you're classifying those cookies within GTM. A lot of the work that I've done, like, seems to happen a lot within these CMPs, and a lot of the work from a code base or website perspective, a lot of that seems to happen mostly involved of like implementing the banner, and a lot of like the UI, UX rather, regarding the design of the banner.
Okay, thank you. And then Allison, one last one. I'm sorry for folks that we're not getting to all of your questions. But is there a single cookie that serves both a necessary function and is also used to collect first-party data? And then if so, is that covered by necessary cookies only consent? I like the loophole you're looking for, by the way.
Very good question. Yeah. And that I think that loophole is exploited often, because there's room to argue what is strictly necessary, what is a legitimate interest of the business. And so that is definitely one of the grayest areas, and something that people use to sort of get away with that. I can't speak specifically if there's one certain type of cookie that uses both, but generally, I think you'll know if you're going too far. I don't know if that's a good way to put it. There's some room there, or a sort of loophole, but I would say you just need to be cautious about dark practices, or which is what they would call, taking too much advantage of those loopholes. At some point, it's obvious that somebody's email address is not strictly necessary for your website to function. So there's some room with those borders, but I think mostly it's their common sense sort of questions and categories.
Awesome. Thank you. So, Allison, Steve, thank you both very much. For the rest of the participants, thank you so much for joining us today. As I mentioned, you're going to get a copy of this deck, so that information will be coming to you from your client success manager. Please connect with Allison if you have any questions or want to follow up further. We're happy to talk with you for the parts that are in our range, that are not legal advice. We're not lawyers. We don't do that. But we really appreciate everything. If you have ideas for additional topics you'd like to see in a town hall in the future, please let us know. But everybody have a wonderful day, and thanks again for joining.